In a valley cradled by gentle, rolling hills, there lay a small village called Oakhaven. It wasn't a grand place, but its people were kind, and the air always smelled of wood smoke and wildflowers. Among the families who called Oakhaven home lived a young girl named Ilara. Ilara was not like the other children. While most girls her age were learning to weave baskets or tend to the garden with delicate hands, Ilara was often found helping her father lift heavy sacks of grain or moving stubborn stones from the fields. From a very young age, it was clear Ilara possessed an unusual strength. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. She could carry water buckets that made older boys grunt, and she could push a wheelbarrow full of firewood as if it were empty. Her arms, though still slender, had a quiet power hidden within them. It wasn't a boastful strength, but a natural gift that made everyday chores a little easier for her family. Her parents, good people who worked hard from dawn till dusk, noticed her unique ability but never made a fuss about it. They simply saw it as another way Ilara contributed to their busy lives. But Ilara's talents weren't just about how much she could lift. She also had a mind that worked as swiftly as a mountain stream. When a problem arose, whether it was a broken fence or a lost lamb, Ilara was often the first to think of a clever solution. One time, a cartwheel snapped right in the middle of the village road, blocking everyone's path. Grown-ups scratched their heads, wondering how to move the heavy cart. Little Ilara, no bigger than a sturdy sapling, didn't hesitate. She found a strong branch, wedged it under the cart, and, with a surprising amount of effort and careful thought, helped pivot the cart just enough for others to pass. The villagers marveled at her quick thinking and the quiet power she brought to every task. Her best friend Liam often joked that Ilara could outsmart a fox and out-wrestle a bear, though she always just laughed in response. Ilara was humble about her gifts, never showing off or boasting. She simply used her strength and her sharp mind to help her family and her neighbors whenever she could. She was a quiet girl with bright, curious eyes that missed nothing, and a heart full of kindness. She loved her village, the way the sun warmed the fields, and the sound of the river flowing nearby. Life in Oakhaven was simple and mostly peaceful. The biggest worries were usually the weather or whether the harvest would be good. No one in Oakhaven had ever seen a soldier or heard the clang of metal boots on their dusty paths. Their world was small, safe, and predictable, much like Ilara's own steady presence within it. She spent her days learning from her parents, helping around their small farm, and exploring the woods with Liam, always observing, always thinking, and always ready to lend a hand with that quiet, surprising strength of hers. Little did she know, the peaceful rhythm of her life and the very fabric of Oakhaven was about to be shaken by the arrival of an unexpected and unwelcome visitor. Her unique gifts, which had always been used for quiet acts of kindness, would soon be tested in a way she could never have imagined. The quiet rhythm of Oakhaven, once as steady and predictable as the turning of the seasons, was shattered one crisp autumn morning. It began not with a rumble of thunder, but with a different kind of sound, a distant, rhythmic thudding that grew louder with each passing moment. The villagers, used only to the gentle sounds of nature and their own daily chores, stopped what they were doing and looked up, their faces etched with confusion and a flicker of unease. Ilara, who was helping her father mend a fence near the edge of the village, felt the ground tremble slightly under her feet. Her keen eyes scanned the horizon, and what she saw made her heart beat a little faster. Through the trees, a line of dark figures appeared, moving with a purpose that was entirely foreign to Oakhaven. They were soldiers, their uniforms dark, their helmets glinting in the morning sun, and their weapons held upright, casting long, threatening shadows. At the head of this grim procession rode a man on a large, dark horse. He was a big man, with a stern face and a thick mustache that bristled under his nose. This was Colonel Cale, and his presence alone seemed to chill the warm autumn air. He wore a uniform that looked much grander and more intimidating than those of his men, adorned with shiny metals that caught the light. He rode with an air of absolute authority, his gaze sweeping over the peaceful village as if it were a minor inconvenience. The villagers, who had slowly gathered in the central square, watched in stunned silence as the soldiers marched into Oakhaven. The rhythmic thud of their boots on the packed earth, the clinking of their gear, and the stern, unsmiling faces of the men created an atmosphere of fear that had never before touched their quiet lives. Children clutched their parents' hands, their eyes wide with worry. Older folk whispered nervously, remembering old stories of faraway lands where such men brought trouble. Colonel Cale reined in his horse directly in front of the village elder, a kind, white-haired man named Master Theron. The colonel's voice boomed, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "I am Colonel Cale," he declared, his voice echoing off the nearby houses. "And my men and I require sustenance. Your village will provide us with food, supplies, and shelter. Immediately." Master Theron, though trembling slightly, stepped forward. "Sir," he began, his voice soft, "we are a small village. Our harvest was modest this year. We have enough for ourselves, but—" Colonel Cale cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Silence. I did not ask for excuses. I demand what is due. My men are weary and hungry. You will provide, or you will face the consequences." His eyes, cold and unyielding, swept over the frightened faces of the villagers. "Every sack of grain, every loaf of bread, every head of livestock, bring it forth, now." The soldiers, without waiting for an answer, began to spread out, their heavy boots tramping through gardens and near doorways. Their presence felt like a dark cloud descending upon Oakhaven. The villagers exchanged worried glances. They knew what this meant. To give up their precious stores now would mean hunger, perhaps even starvation, in the coming winter. Their peaceful existence had vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying reality. Alara watched it all, her heart heavy, a knot forming in her stomach. The gentle world she knew was gone, and a new harsh reality had arrived with Colonel Cale and his demanding soldiers. As Colonel Cale's harsh words hung in the air, a wave of desperate urgency spread through the village. The soldiers were already moving, their heavy boots tramping through gardens and poking into sheds. Alara's father, a strong man named Yorn, pulled her mother, Lena, and Alara herself, quickly toward their small cottage. His face was grim, a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. "We must hide what we can," Yorn whispered, his voice tight with worry. "The winter, it will be too hard without it." Their family, like many in Oakhaven, had little enough to spare. They had a small sack of dried beans and a few loaves of hearty bread, carefully stored away. This was their hope for the colder months, a slender thread of survival against the coming snows. Losing it would mean true hardship. Inside their modest home, the air was thick with quiet panic. Lena moved swiftly, grabbing the sack of beans. "Under the floorboards," she breathed, pointing to a loose plank near the hearth. Alara, with her unusual strength, knelt and easily pried up the heavy wooden board. Her hands worked quickly, carefully placing the sack into the hidden space. Just as they were pushing the plank back into place, a shadow fell across the doorway. A soldier, taller and broader than Ilara's father, stood framed in the light, his uniform dark and imposing. He had a stern face, and his eyes, as cold as chips of ice, scanned the small room. He carried a long rifle, its barrel glinting faintly. Ilara's heart jumped into her throat. She froze, her hand still resting on the recently replaced floorboard. Her father stepped in front of her, trying to shield her from the soldier's gaze, but it was too late. The soldier had already seen. "What are you hiding?" The soldier barked, his voice rough. He took a step further into the room, his eyes narrowed on the spot where Ilara had been kneeling. Jorn tried to sound calm, though his voice wavered. "Nothing, sir. Just tidying up." But the soldier was not fooled. He pointed his rifle at the floor. "Open it. Now." Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ilara's mind raced, searching for an excuse, a diversion, anything to keep their precious food safe. But the soldier's presence filled the small room, leaving no space for tricks. The soldier took another step, his heavy boot landing with a thud on the floorboard. He knelt, his strong fingers finding the edge of the plank. With a grunt, he pulled it up, revealing the hidden sack of beans. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the soldier's satisfied sigh. He grabbed the sack, his grip firm. "So, you try to defy Colonel Kale, do you?" He sneered, looking from Jorn to Lena to Ilara. "Every last bit," he said. "Every last bit." He straightened up, the sack of beans slung over his shoulder, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Consider this a lesson," he said, turning to leave. As he walked out, his boots echoed loudly, carrying away their family's hope for the winter. Ilara watched him go, a mix of anger and helplessness bubbling inside her. Her parents looked defeated, their shoulders slumped. The small act of defiance had failed, and now the harsh reality of the soldier's demands truly settled upon them. This wasn't just about the village anymore. It was about their very survival, taken by force from their own home. Ilara felt a spark ignite within her, a feeling she hadn't known before, a quiet, burning resolve. The soldier who took their beans left, his heavy boots echoing away, leaving Ilara's family in a silent, hurting huddle. Her mother wept softly, and her father stared at the empty space under the floorboards, his face a mask of despair. The quiet resolve that had sparked in Ilara now began to burn hotter, turning into a fiery determination. She could not stand by and watch her family, her village, be stripped bare. Ilara walked out of her cottage, her small frame straight, her eyes fixed on the center of the village. There, Colonel Kyle sat upon his horse, overseeing his soldiers as they gathered the villagers' meager stores. Sacks of grain, baskets of apples, even a frightened goat were being piled high, ready to be taken away. The air was thick with the silent tears of mothers and the hushed protests of fathers. Colonel Kyle, still on his horse, looked like a dark statue of power, his face hard and unyielding. As one of his men dragged a small, shivering lamb away from its crying owner, Ilara could bear it no longer. Without a word to her parents, she began to walk toward the colonel. Each step was firm, fueled by a mixture of anger and a desperate hope that she could somehow make a difference. Her path led her directly toward the pile of stolen goods, which was guarded by several soldiers. Ilara didn't stop. She walked with a purpose, her small figure seemingly insignificant against the backdrop of armed men and stolen provisions. One of the soldiers noticed her approaching and frowned. "Hey girl, get back," he shouted, his voice rough. Ilara ignored him. She kept walking, her gaze locked on Colonel Kyle. The colonel, who had been barking orders, finally noticed the small figure moving purposefully toward him. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of the determined young girl. He watched her approach, a flicker of amusement crossing his stern face. Elara stopped a few feet from his horse, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting his. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The fear had turned into something else, something strong and sharp. "You cannot take all our food," Elara said, her voice surprisingly clear, though it trembled slightly. "We will starve this winter." Colonel Kale looked down at her, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. It was a cold, mocking sound that made the other soldiers smirk. He clearly found her attempt at defiance laughable. He tilted his head, his eyes glinting with amusement. "And who are you, little mouse, to tell me what I can and cannot do?" He scoffed, his voice dripping with scorn. "This is war, girl. Your village pays its tribute." "This is not war. This is stealing." Elara shot back, her voice gaining strength. The colonel's amusement deepened. He leaned forward slightly on his horse, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He found her spirit amusing, a tiny spark in a world he dominated. He raised his hand, gesturing dismissively. "Get out of my way, girl," he laughed, the sound loud and scornful, echoing across the silent square. "Go back to your dolls and leave the real world to men." His words were meant to dismiss her, to make her feel small and powerless. But they had the opposite effect. They ignited a fire in Elara that burned brighter than any she had ever known. His laughter, his scorn, solidified her resolve. She would not move. Colonel Kyle's laughter echoed, a harsh, cold sound that seemed to mock Elara and the entire suffering village. His words, "Go back to your dolls and leave the real world to men," were meant to crush her spirit, to make her feel small and insignificant. But instead, they ignited something fierce within Elara. The quiet girl who once moved stones and helped her father now felt a blaze of courage. She would not be dismissed. She would not be silent. Her eyes, usually gentle and observant, now blazed with a fire that surprised even herself. She looked at the colonel, then down at the long, heavy rifle that hung from his saddle, its polished wood and cold metal a symbol of the power he wielded over them. It was a weapon of fear, a tool that took away their food and their peace. A sudden, daring thought flashed through Elara's mind, quick as lightning. It was risky, perhaps even foolish, but the sight of her parents' defeated faces and the hungry eyes of the village children spurred her on. She had to do something, anything, to stop this injustice. Without a second's hesitation, before anyone, especially Colonel Kale, could react, Elara moved. Her small body, usually so careful and quiet, now moved with a burst of speed and purpose. She darted forward, closer to the colonel's horse than any villager dared to be. The colonel, still smirking, was caught completely off guard. He expected her to shrink away, to cry, to obey. He certainly did not expect her to defy him further. His hand was still raised in a dismissive gesture, his eyes still sparkling with cruel amusement. But Elara was already reaching. Her hands, small but incredibly strong, shot out. She grabbed the rifle, not the barrel, which might be hot or dangerous, but the sturdy wooden stock, just below where it hung from the saddle. Her fingers wrapped around the cold, smooth wood, holding it tight. The suddenness of her action stunned everyone. The soldiers guarding the piled-up food gasped. The villagers, who had been watching in despair, now stared with wide, disbelieving eyes. Even Colonel Cale's mocking smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock. His eyes widened, and he let out a surprised grunt as he felt a sudden tug on his rifle. He tried to pull it back, to assert his ownership and authority over the weapon. "Hey, what do you think you're doing, girl?" he roared, his voice losing its amusement and turning into a sharp, angry command. His hand instinctively went to secure the rifle, but Alara's grip was already firm. She held on, her small body braced, her muscles tensing. It was heavier than she expected, a solid weight of wood and metal. But her unusual strength gave her an advantage. She pulled, not letting go, her face set in a fierce determination. She wasn't just grabbing a rifle. She was grabbing a symbol of their oppression, a piece of the power that was crushing her village. In that moment, Alara felt truly brave. A small girl standing against a powerful man and his army, holding on to a weapon that represented everything they were fighting against. Alara gripped the colonel's rifle, her small hands wrapped tightly around the cold, hard wood. Colonel Cale roared in surprise and anger, trying to yank his weapon free. He pulled hard, expecting the tiny girl to let go, to stumble backward, to be easily overpowered. But Alara held on, her feet planted firmly on the dusty ground. The strength that usually helped her with chores now surged through her, magnified by her anger and the desperate need to protect her village. Her muscles tensed, a deep, powerful force rising from within her. She wasn't just holding on. She was pulling back, putting all her will and all her unusual might into the tug of war. The rifle, a heavy piece of military equipment, became the focus of a silent battle between a powerful man and a determined child. For a moment, it seemed like nothing would give. The colonel pulled, his face red with rage. Alara pulled, her own face set in a fierce mask of concentration. The air crackled with tension. The soldiers, who had been about to step forward, froze, their mouths slightly open in disbelief. The villagers watched, their fear momentarily replaced by a stunned, hopeful silence. Then, with a sudden, incredible burst of strength, Alara gave one last, mighty pull. She twisted her body, using every ounce of her unique power. A sharp, loud crack ripped through the quiet square. It was the sound of something breaking, something solid and unyielding giving way. Everyone gasped. Colonel Cale stumbled backward on his horse, his eyes wide with shock. He was holding only half of his rifle. The other half, the barrel and the firing mechanism, was still firmly clutched in Alara's small hands. She had snapped it clean in two. The polished wooden stock had splintered, the metal bent and broken, leaving two jagged, useless pieces. The sound of the breaking rifle seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute silence. It was a sound that no one, not the villagers, not the soldiers, and certainly not Colonel Cale, had ever expected to hear. The colonel stared at the broken piece of his weapon, then at Alara, then back at the shattered rifle in his hand, his face a mixture of fury and utter bewilderment. The soldiers, who moments before had been ready to mock Alara, now stood frozen, their own rifles seeming less mighty in their hands. They exchanged nervous glances, their bravado replaced by a visible unease. A small, frail-looking girl had just broken their leader's weapon, as if it were a dry twig. It was impossible. It was unbelievable. Yet, it had just happened right before their very eyes. Alara stood there, breathing hard, still clutching the broken half of the rifle. Her chest rose and fell quickly, but her gaze on Colonel Cale was steady, unwavering. The broken rifle in her hands was no longer a symbol of fear, but a symbol of something else entirely. A symbol of unexpected power, of defiance, and of a will that could not be easily crushed. The entire village square was silent, completely shocked by the incredible sight. The silence in Oakhaven Square was deafening, thicker than any fog. It was a silence born of sheer disbelief, broken only by Alara's quick, hard breaths. Colonel Kale, still on his horse, stared at the two broken pieces of his once proud rifle, then at the small girl who had shattered it. His face was a mixture of anger, shock, and something else, something that looked a lot like fear. But it wasn't just the colonel who was shaken. His soldiers, who had arrived with such arrogance and power, were now a frozen tableau of surprise. Their eyes, which had been so cold and commanding, now darted between the broken rifle and Alara with open-mouthed wonder. These were men trained for battle. Men who had seen many things, but never anything like this. A murmur began to ripple through their ranks. It wasn't a loud sound, more like the buzzing of a disturbed beehive. But it was enough to show their unease. The soldiers shifted their weight, their grip on their own rifles suddenly less confident. They looked at Alara, a small girl, hardly reaching their waists. And yet she had done what seemed impossible. Their leader's rifle, a symbol of their strength and control, lay in two useless pieces because of her. One soldier, a burly man with a scarred face, instinctively took a step back. His eyes were wide, and he licked his lips nervously. Another whispered to his comrade, "Did you see that? It just snapped." His voice was low, filled with a touch of awe and a good deal of fear. They had expected tears, pleading, or perhaps even a futile struggle from the villagers. They had not expected this raw, unexplainable power from a child. The bravado that had filled the square when they first arrived was draining away, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. How could they fight against someone who could break a rifle with her bare hands? What other strange powers might she possess? To these men, who relied on their weapons and their numbers, Alara's act was not just an act of defiance. It was something almost magical, something outside their understanding. It felt like a bad omen, a sign that this small, quiet village might hold more dangers than they had ever imagined. They looked at each other, then back at Colonel Kale, hoping for a command, a reassurance. But the colonel himself seemed lost for words. His face was still a mask of shock, his eyes fixed on Alara as if she were some kind of myth come to life. The hierarchy of power, so clear just moments ago, had been turned on its head. The mighty soldiers, who had been taking whatever they pleased, now found themselves facing a small girl whose quiet strength had shattered not just a rifle, but their sense of control. The fear wasn't just about Alara's strength, though that was certainly part of it. It was about the unknown, about the sudden, shocking way she had broken their rigid order. They were soldiers, not magicians, and Alara's feat felt like something beyond the ordinary world they knew. A shiver ran through their ranks, a collective realization that this simple task of plundering a village had just become far more complicated and far more terrifying than any of them had anticipated. Their confidence had been severely shaken, and a seed of genuine fear had been planted in their hearts. The shattered silence in Oakhaven Square pressed down on everyone, but most of all on Colonel Kale. His face, usually a mask of stern control, was now a storm of conflicting feelings. Anger, red and hot, flared in his eyes. How dare this slip of a girl, this mere child, defy him so publicly? How dare she destroy his personal rifle, a fine piece of weaponry and a symbol of his rank? The humiliation burned him. Yet, beneath the rage, another feeling stirred, one he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge: awe. He was a seasoned military man, a commander who had seen great feats of strength and courage on battlefields. But he had never witnessed anything like this. A rifle, made of sturdy wood and hardened steel, was not meant to be broken by bare hands, especially not the hands of a young girl. It was an act that defied logic, an impossible display of raw, unexpected power. His eyes, still wide with shock, fixed on Alara. He looked at her small, still trembling hands clutching the broken barrel, and then at the broken stock still in his own grip. The splintered wood, the bent metal, it was undeniable proof. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a dream. This was real. A cold shiver, not of fear for his own safety, but of a deeper, unsettling dread, ran down his spine. He was a man who understood power, who wielded it without mercy. But Alara's power was different. It was wild, untamed, and utterly unpredictable. It wasn't the trained might of a soldier, but something primal and mysterious. He suddenly felt a prickle of genuine fear, not for what she might do next with her hands, but for what she represented. This small girl had, in one swift, impossible motion, shown him that his authority was not absolute, that his weapons were not invincible. He glanced at his soldiers. Their faces mirrored his own confusion and unease, amplified by the fact that they were mere men, not a powerful commander. They were looking at Alara with wide eyes, whispering nervously, their hands hovering over their own rifles as if questioning their effectiveness. The chain of command, the iron grip of discipline, seemed to loosen in that moment of collective astonishment. Colonel Kale cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but his voice was rougher than usual. He still held the broken stock, a ridiculous prop, in his hand. He looked from his men, whose fear was now palpable, back to Alara. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering, her small frame radiating a quiet strength that felt stronger than all his armed men combined. He had called her a little mouse, told her to go back to her dolls. Now, the mouse had roared, and the dolls were replaced by a shattered rifle. The laughter had died in his throat, replaced by a grudging respect he would never admit, and a healthy dose of apprehension. He was still Colonel Kale, still a man of power. But in this moment, facing this child, he felt a crack in his armor, a sudden understanding that some forces could not be simply dismissed or conquered with a sneer. The game had changed, and he knew it. The air in Oakhaven Square was thick with unspoken questions and lingering shock. Colonel Kyle, still holding the broken half of his rifle, looked down at Alara, his face a complex mix of anger, confusion, and a grudging respect he would never have thought possible. His soldiers shifted uneasily, their gaze fixed on the small girl who had just performed an impossible feat. This was the moment. This was the opening. Alara, though still breathing hard from her immense effort, felt a surge of clarity. The fear that had gripped the village, and indeed herself, had not completely vanished, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. She looked at the piled-up food, at the shivering goat tied to a post, at the worried faces of her neighbors. This was her chance. She held up the broken barrel of the rifle, its jagged edges catching the light. Her voice, though still young, now carried a new, unwavering strength that cut through the silence. "You see what I can do?" Alara stated, her eyes locking onto Colonel Kale's. There was no tremor in her voice now, only a quiet, fierce demand. "You have taken our food, our hope for the winter. You have frightened our children and insulted our elder." She took a step forward, her small figure appearing much larger in that moment. The soldiers flinched slightly, their hands moving towards their own weapons. but none dared to raise them. They were waiting for their colonel's command, but he remained silent, mesmerized by the girl's sudden authority. "We are peaceful people," Alara continued, her voice rising slightly. "We have no army, no weapons like yours. But we have our lives, and we will not let you starve us." She gestured with the broken rifle toward the assembled soldiers and the stolen goods. "Leave us. Take your men and leave our village alone. Leave our food and do not return." Her demand hung in the air, bold and clear. It was an astonishing challenge from a child to a powerful military leader. The villagers, who had been too afraid to speak, now looked at Alara with dawning hope and admiration. Her parents, who had watched the entire scene unfold in a state of disbelief, felt a mix of terror and immense pride swelling in their chests. Colonel Kale's mouth twitched. He wanted to rage, to shout orders, to assert his dominance. But the sight of his broken rifle, the memory of the impossible snap, and the uneasy glances of his own men held him back. He saw the fear in their eyes, the doubt that Alara had planted. He knew that if he ordered them to attack her, to try and take her, they might hesitate. And hesitation in soldiers was a dangerous thing. He looked around the square, at the villagers who now dared to meet his gaze, their fear lessened by Alara's courage. He looked at Alara, small but formidable, holding a piece of his broken power. He knew, in that moment, that he could not simply dismiss her anymore. She had gained a strange kind of power over him and his men, a power born of shock and the unknown. He had to choose: fight this impossible child and risk further humiliation and perhaps even a mutiny of spirit among his men, or retreat with what little dignity he had left. The choice, though difficult for his proud heart, was becoming clear. Alara had seized the moment, and with it, a chance for Oakhaven. Alara's bold demand hung in the air, a challenge that no one in Oakhaven had ever dared to utter. Colonel Kyle, still astride his horse, looked from her fierce, unwavering gaze to the uneasy faces of his soldiers. He saw their whispers, their nervous shifts, the way their eyes kept darting to the broken rifle in his hand, then to the one Alara held. Their fear was like a visible shroud, chilling the autumn day. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to shout orders, to crush this insolent girl. He was Colonel Kale, a man who took what he wanted, a man who never backed down. But his mind, sharp and tactical even in its anger, quickly assessed the situation. His men were shaken. Their morale, usually as sturdy as their armor, was now fragile. If he pushed them against a force they viewed as unnatural, a child who could break steel, who knew what would happen? They might falter, refuse, or worse, their fear might spread like wildfire. He glanced at the villagers. Their faces, once filled with despair, now held a glimmer of hope and defiant support for Alara. He knew that if he tried to take her or to harm her, the villagers, emboldened by her courage, might rise up in a desperate, futile struggle that would be messy and inconvenient. And for what? A few sacks of grain? The humiliation of being defied by a child was already greater than any prize he could gain here. Colonel Kale let out a slow, controlled breath. The anger was still there, a burning coal in his chest. But reason, cold and clear, began to take over. He couldn't afford a rebellion, even a small one, especially when his own troops were looking at him with such uncertainty. He straightened up on his horse, his eyes still fixed on Alara. He raised the broken stock of his rifle, a strange, half-hearted gesture of surrender. "Very well, girl," he growled, his voice rough but devoid of its earlier mocking tone. It was a concession, a bitter pill for a man of his pride to swallow. Your display of strength has convinced me this village is more trouble than it is worth. A collective gasp, a mix of relief and disbelief, rippled through the villagers. They hadn't dared to hope. Colonel Kale turned his head slightly to address his men. His voice, though still gruff, was now a command. "Pack it up, everything. We leave this place, now." The soldiers, relieved to finally have an order, any order, that didn't involve confronting the strange girl, sprang into action. They began to unload the carts, returning the sacks of grain and baskets of food to the growing pile in the center of the square. The frightened goat was untied, and it quickly scampered back to its owner. Alara watched, her heart thumping with a mix of triumph and disbelief. She had done it. She, a small girl, had faced down a powerful colonel and his army and won. Colonel Kale still looked furious, but he was leaving. That was all that mattered. The fierce determination in Alara's eyes did not waver until she saw the last soldier begin to unfasten the ropes from a cart full of stolen goods. He was keeping his word. The village was safe. With Colonel Kale's grudging command to leave, a wave of hurried activity swept through the soldier ranks. The air, which had been thick with tension and fear, now began to lighten with the promise of departure. The soldiers, no longer looking like fierce conquerors, moved with a newfound eagerness to simply be gone from Oakhaven. They quickly unpiled the villagers' goods, returning the sacks of grain, bundles of dried herbs, and baskets of fruit to the growing mound in the center of the square. Alara watched, still clutching the broken half of the colonel's rifle, her eyes scanning every movement. She wouldn't truly believe it until she saw them ride away. Her parents, along with Master Theron and the other villagers, slowly started to gather around the returned provisions, their faces a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The children, sensing the change, peeked out from behind their parents, their wide eyes following the soldiers. Colonel Kale, his face still red with barely controlled fury and humiliation, remained on his horse, overseeing the retreat. He snatched the other broken half of his rifle from the ground and glared at it, then at Alara, before tossing both pieces into an empty cart with a clatter. He barked out orders, his voice still harsh, but now tinged with a desperate need for efficiency. He wanted to leave this place, this impossible village, and its impossible girl, as quickly as possible. The soldiers began to form ranks, their horses whinnying softly. The carts, once meant to carry away Oakhaven's sustenance, were now empty, or carried only the soldiers' own gear. The rhythmic thud of their boots, which had brought such dread upon their arrival, now signaled hope. Each step away from the village felt like a step toward freedom for the villagers. Finally, Colonel Kale turned his horse. He cast one last, lingering, resentful look at Alara, who stood unmoving, a silent sentinel in the square. Then, without another word, he spurred his horse forward. His soldiers followed, their ranks somewhat less orderly than when they had arrived, their heads held a little lower. The sounds of their marching boots and the creaking of their carts slowly faded into the distance. The dark shapes of their uniforms disappeared behind the line of trees from which they had first emerged. The village square, which had been so full of menacing noise, was now filled with a wondrous silence. The villagers stood still for a moment, not daring to move, as if breaking the quiet might somehow bring the soldiers back. Then, a collective sigh of relief swept through Oakhaven. Master Theron was the first to speak, his voice choked with emotion. "They're gone," he whispered, almost to himself. "They're truly gone." Joy, tentative at first, then bursting forth, filled the air. Mothers hugged their children, fathers clapped each other on the back. Tears of relief streamed down faces that had been grim with fear just moments before. The sun, which had seemed to hide behind clouds, now shone brighter, warming the grateful faces of the people of Oakhaven. The village was safe. Their food was safe. And a young girl named Ilara had made it so. As the last faint echo of the soldiers' boots vanished, a wave of profound relief washed over Oakhaven. The villagers, who had been frozen in a mixture of fear and hope, now burst into shouts of joy and heartfelt embraces. They quickly gathered their returned food, laughing and crying as they checked their precious stores. But their joy was not just for the food. It was for their freedom and for the incredible courage that had saved them. All eyes turned to Ilara, who still stood in the center of the square, holding the broken rifle like a strange trophy. Her parents rushed to her, her mother Lena pulling her into a tight, tearful hug. "My brave girl," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Jorn, Ilara's father, clapped her gently on the shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. Master Theron, the village elder, stepped forward, his wise old face beaming. He raised his hands for silence, and the joyous clamor slowly quieted. "Friends, neighbors," he called out, his voice strong and clear. "Today, we faced a great darkness, and we were saved by a light brighter than any star." He turned to Ilara, his eyes full of respect. "Ilara, you have shown us what true courage is. You faced down a tyrant with nothing but your brave heart and your incredible strength. You are the hero of Oakhaven." A cheer erupted, louder and more heartfelt than any sound the village had ever made. The villagers rushed forward, not with fear, but with open admiration. Children, who had hidden from the soldiers, now ran up to Ilara, tugging at her clothes, their eyes wide with wonder. "You broke the big man's stick," one little boy exclaimed, pointing at the rifle. Ilara, who had always been a quiet girl, unused to such attention, felt her cheeks grow warm. She looked at the faces around her, full of gratitude and love, and a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't just Ilara, the girl who helped her father with heavy chores anymore. She was Ilara, the girl who had saved Oakhaven. The celebration lasted late into the evening. A special feast was quickly prepared with some of the returned food, a feast of thanks and joy. Stories of Ilara's bravery were told and retold, each time growing a little grander, a little more amazing. People spoke of her unwavering gaze, her quick action, and the unbelievable crack of the rifle. Ilara sat by the fire, listening to the tales, a small smile playing on her lips. She felt a deep sense of contentment. She hadn't sought to be a hero. She had simply acted when she saw injustice. But in doing so, she had become something more than she ever imagined. She had given her village not just their food back, but their hope, their pride, and a new story of courage that would be passed down for generations. Her strength, once a quiet helper, had become a powerful shield. And her quick thinking, a sharp weapon against oppression. Oakhaven had found its champion, and her name was Ilara. The celebration in Oakhaven was not a secret. It was too loud, too joyous, too full of grateful hearts. Travelers and traders passing through the valley in the days that followed heard the amazing tales. They heard how Colonel Kale, a feared commander, had come to Oakhaven to take their food, and how a small girl had stood against him. They heard with wide, disbelieving eyes about the girl who snapped a rifle. At first, people whispered about it, unsure if the stories could be true. A girl breaking a soldier's weapon with her bare hands. It sounded like a fable, a legend from old times. But the story was always told with such conviction by the people of Oakhaven, their eyes shining with truth, that it was hard to doubt. And then there was the missing rifle, or rather, the broken rifle that Colonel Cale had tossed into his cart, a clear sign of his unexpected defeat. The news spread like wildfire through the valley and beyond, carried by merchants on their wagons, by messengers on horseback, and by simple folk walking from one market town to the next. From the quiet farming village of Willow Creek to the bustling trading post of Stonehaven, everyone soon knew about Ilara. In many villages, people had been living in fear, constantly worried that soldiers would come and take their harvests, leaving them to starve. They felt small and helpless against the armed men. But the story of Ilara changed something. It planted a tiny seed of hope, a spark of courage in hearts that had grown heavy with despair. In one small village called Greendale, where the crops had been poor and the people were bracing for a harsh winter, the news of Ilara arrived just as a small group of soldiers was approaching. The villagers, usually quick to hide their meager stores, hesitated. They remembered the story of Oakhaven, of the girl who had not bowed down. A young woman in Greendale, named Lyra, who had always been timid, suddenly found her voice. "If a girl can stand up to them," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "then perhaps we can too. Not with strength like hers, but with our own way." Inspired by Ilara, Lyra and the other villagers gathered, not to fight, but to firmly state their hardship and refusal, backed by a newfound unity. The soldiers, used to easy targets, found themselves facing a community that, though unarmed, was no longer meek. The tales of Ilara began to inspire others in different ways, too. Parents in other villages told their daughters the story, not just as a warning, but as a lesson in bravery. They spoke of how strength could come in many forms, and that even the smallest person could make a huge difference if their heart was brave and their mind was quick. Ilara herself remained in Oakhaven, still helping her family, but now with a quiet fame. People would sometimes travel to Oakhaven just to catch a glimpse of the girl who snapped a rifle. They would nod in respect, seeing in her quiet strength a reflection of the courage they hoped to find in themselves. The peaceful Oakhaven had become a symbol, and Ilara, its unexpected beacon of hope, inspiring countless others to find their own quiet strength in the face of daunting challenges. The story of her courage truly changed things for many people, in many places. After the soldiers left and the celebrations faded into happy memories, Ilara found herself changed, not just in the eyes of her village, but within herself. She still helped her father with the heaviest tasks, and her strength remained. But she saw it differently now. Before, it was just a part of her, a useful tool. Now, it was a power that, when combined with courage, could protect. One quiet afternoon, while helping her mother gather herbs in the sunny meadow, Ilara thought about the day Colonel Kyle arrived. She remembered the knot of fear in her stomach, the feeling of helplessness as the soldier took their beans. Then she recalled the spark of resolve, the anger that had driven her forward, and the sudden, burning bravery that made her grab the rifle. Her mother, Lena, watched her thoughtful expression. "You saved us, Ilara," she said softly, reaching out to gently touch her daughter's hand. Ilara looked at her mother. "I was scared, Mama," she admitted, a little voice inside her still remembering the fear. "Very scared." Lena smiled kindly. "That's what makes it true courage, my dear. Not being unafraid, but doing what's right even when you are afraid." Ilara thought about this. She realized that her muscles, strong as they were, wouldn't have been enough without the brave heart that pushed her to act. It wasn't just the physical power to snap the rifle that had made the difference. It was the decision to stand up, to speak out, to risk everything for her home and her people. That brave heart had made her strong enough to even try. She remembered Colonel Cale's mocking laughter, his dismissive words. He had seen her as just a girl, small and powerless. He had only seen her size, not the fire in her spirit. He had thought his weapons were the only source of strength. But she had shown him otherwise. Alara understood now that real strength wasn't just about how much weight you could lift, or how loud you could shout, or how many shiny weapons you carried. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about believing in yourself and your village, even when faced with big, scary challenges. It was about caring enough to act, even when your knees were shaking. Her quick thinking had helped her find a way to challenge the colonel, and her physical strength had let her carry it out. But it was her brave heart that had set it all in motion. The stories told in Oakhaven and beyond were never just about the girl with amazing strength. They were about the girl who dared. From that day on, Alara carried her lessons with her. She knew that true power was a quiet fire within, a mix of spirit, thought, and courage. She continued to be the helpful, strong girl of Oakhaven. But now she was also its symbol of hope, a living reminder that even the smallest person, with a brave heart, can overcome the biggest challenges. She learned that courage wasn't something you had or didn't have. It was a choice you made, and that choice could make you truly strong.